Tonight, we drift backward. Not through kingdoms or conquests, but into something quieter. Something slower. A life lived by the rhythm of waves and the breath of the tide. Before the sun, before the rooster stirs, there is a man standing barefoot in the sand. His name is forgotten in the pages of history, but his days were once as real as yours. He rose not for glory, not for gold, but for fish. This is not the story of kings or knights. It is the story of a fisherman. Of brine-soaked mornings, of hands calloused by rope, of quiet prayers whispered to the sea. So if you're ready, close your eyes. Let your thoughts settle like silt at the bottom of a still pond, and follow me gently into the quiet world of a medieval fishing village. As it wakes, the sky was still dark when Edwin rose from his straw-stuffed mattress, the smell of damp rushes and cold stone lingering in the air. The hearth had long since gone cold, its last embers dying sometime in the early hours. A faint chill clung to the inside of the cottage, but Edwin didn't shiver. He was used to the cold, just as he was used to waking before the sun. A thin line of starlight slipped in through the wooden shutter, barely cracked. Outside, the thatched rooftops of the village still slept. Only the occasional hoot of an owl or the distant bark of a dog hinted at life beyond his door. He sat up slowly, careful not to wake his wife Elfrida, still bundled in the woolen blanket. Her soft breathing was steady, untroubled. He watched her for a moment, then reached for the tunic he'd laid over the stool the night before, the fabric still faintly warm from yesterday's wear. His fingers found the edges of his boots, dried by the fire's warmth the day before, and slid into them without sound. Edwin moved like the tide, steady, slow, inevitable. A small bundle of nets lay near the door. He gathered them, coiling them with the care of someone who knew how a careless tangle could cost precious time, or fish. With a final glance at the hearth, he opened the door and stepped outside. The dawn had not yet come, but the sky was softening at the edges. It was that quiet hour when the world held its breath, suspended between night and morning. The wind was light but insistent, tugging at the sleeves of his tunic and lifting the scent of damp earth and distant sea. He walked the worn path through the village, boots pressing into the dewy grass. Smoke did not yet curl from chimneys. No voices called. Only the hush of nature, the soft stir of leaves, the sigh of the wind across the meadows, accompanied him. The path narrowed as it neared the river, bordered by wild grasses, bent from the weight of morning dew. Here Edwin paused. He always paused. There was something sacred about this moment, this hush before work, before noise, before men took up their burdens. A moment to be small in the face of the great sky, the slow water, the earth. He let his fingers graze a thistle and watched the silver thread of mist rise off the river. This river which knew his father and his grandfather. This river which fed him, clothed him, raised his children. He knew every bend of it, every snag beneath the surface, every season of its mood. The boat rocked gently against the bank where he'd left it. Old and worn, patched more than once, but it floated true. Edwin stepped in, set down the nets and picked up the oars. And so began another day, not remarkable, not dramatic, but full like all the others. Quiet, enduring, wrapped in the rhythm of a life shaped by wind, water, and waiting. The oars dipped into the water with a soft, familiar rhythm. Creak, pull, drift, like a lullaby passed down through generations. Edwin rowed not with urgency but with ease, his body remembering the movements before his mind needed to command them. The mist swirled low over the river, veiling the banks in a pale shimmer. Waterbirds, startled by the disturbance, lifted lazily into the air, their wings barely flapping. The river knew him. It flowed the same each morning, yet never quite the same. Some days the current pulled stronger, some days the wind rose against him, and on others, like today, it simply allowed. The kind of day when the world did not resist a man's work. He passed the willows first, their long fingers dipping into the river, brushing the surface like sleepy guardians. Beyond them, the meadows opened wide. Low stone walls held sheep still huddled together, unmoving in the dawn chill. He saw no shepherd, but knew the boys would be along soon, whistling and swinging their crooks with the bravado of youth. Further down the river, Edwin let the boat drift. He reached into the shallow hold behind him and lifted the first net. Coarse and hand-mended, it carried the smell of brine and thyme. He leaned over the edge, scanning the current for the familiar eddies, places where fish liked to pause, rest, turn. And then, with a practiced toss, he cast the net. The splash barely disturbed the stillness. He waited. Patience was more than a virtue in fishing, it was the very shape of the craft. To wait, to read the signs, to understand what could not be rushed. While the net settled, he sat back. The oars rested against the sides, and the gentle bob of the boat rocked him in quiet rhythm. The sun at last edged over the distant treetops, casting streaks of soft gold on the river's surface. Mist lifted like breath, slow and rising. A kingfisher flashed past, bright as a spark, vanishing into the trees. Edwin smiled faintly. Not at anything in particular, just the quiet beauty of it. A morning well-formed. The kind that asked nothing more of him than to be present. He checked the net. A few fish glimmered in its tangle, river perch, small but enough. He lifted it carefully, laying them into a wooden bucket lined with damp moss. More than food, they were a promise. A fire that would crackle in his hearth by dusk. A meal shared with Elfrida and their youngest daughter, Emma. Coins, perhaps, from the surplus, traded for flour or candle stubs or beeswax for the winter. As the sun climbed higher, Edwin rode onward, casting again, pulling, waiting. The day unfolded slowly in layers. He knew where the good rocks lay beneath the surface. He knew where otters sometimes played, though rarely seen. He even knew the half-fallen birch at the bend in the river that always made the current speak louder. This was his road. Others traveled dusty paths between villages, but Edwin's world flowed in water and reed. When the nets were nearly full, and the boat held its gentle weight in silvered catch, he leaned back and rested his arms across his knees. The sun was warmer now and the wind had softened. The river glinted and gurgled like a friend in a good mood. There was no great drama to his day. No battles fought, no speeches made, no history written in the books of lords. But there was a kind of quiet triumph in a morning like this. A man and his boat, his skill, his rhythm, and the river that accepted him. As he turned the boat back toward home, Edwin felt the soft pull of hunger, the anticipation of warm bread, the scent of smoke curling from his chimney. The world was slow and wide and kind. By mid-morning, the river behind him shimmered in the light of a warming sun. Edwin guided the small boat toward the shallows, where the reeds grew thick and dragonflies skimmed the water like drifting embers. He stepped into the cool river, boots splashing softly, and pulled the boat onto the pebbled bank behind his cottage. His home sat quiet and squat at the edge of the trees, a wattle-end daub house with a thatched roof, a little stooped from age yet still sound. Smoke curled from the chimney in a steady plume, smelling faintly of oak and ash. A chicken clucked lazily nearby, pecking at the earth with no great urgency. Edwin carried the morning's catch in 2 buckets, their handles creaking against his calloused fingers. He paused at the door, brushing the river's dampness from his tunic, and stepped inside. The warmth wrapped around him like an old cloak. Elfrida stood near the hearth, her sleeves rolled up, her hands dusted with flour. A loaf of bread rested on a wooden board beside her, its surface golden and split from the fire's heat. She didn't look up right away but smiled when she heard his boots on the floorboards. "You've brought back the smell of river?" she said softly. Edwin set the buckets down and leaned to kiss her cheek, tasting a trace of salt and smoke. "And a fair haul today," he replied. "Enough for supper and perhaps a few to trade." From the corner came the sound of soft humming. Little Emma sat cross-legged on a woven mat, her pale doll nestled in her arms. She rocked it gently, mimicking the lullabies her mother once sang to her. The light from the hearth flickered across her round face, painting it in tones of amber and rose. She looked up and beamed. "Papa, did you catch a big one?" "3 small ones and one with a proud tail," he said with a grin. "You'll see him when I clean them." He knelt to open the buckets and Emma rushed over, careful not to tip them. She peered in wide-eyed. The fish shimmered like wet coins in the firelight, their gills faintly twitching. "They look like moonlight," she whispered. Elfrida handed Edwin a cup of barley tea, warm and nutty. He took it with both hands, grateful for the comfort of it. The fire crackled low behind them, filling the space with a living hush. No one rushed. There was no call to market, no clamor at the door. Just the rhythm of home. He set to work gutting and scaling the fish on the chopping block outside, rinsing his hands in the water barrel afterward. Elfrida busied herself with slicing onions and herbs she dried weeks ago, while Emma skipped around the courtyard chasing shadows of birds. By midday the stew bubbled gently in the pot. The aroma filled every room, a mix of river, earth, and time. Edwin sat by the window, repairing one of his nets with careful fingers, threading and knotting, knotting and threading in the slow ritual he knew well. From the fields beyond, the distant murmur of village life carried faintly, cows being driven to pasture, children shouting in play, a dog barking at a crow. Life moved outward in quiet spirals, each family in their rhythm, each day a small echo of the last. Inside their home the rhythm was slower, simpler. built of small things: the creak of wood underfoot, the clatter of wooden bowls, the hush of wind against the shutters. When the stew was ready, they ate together at the low table, steam rising into the rafters. Emma giggled when a bit of onion slipped from her spoon. Elfrida shook her head, amused. Edwin chewed in silence, watching them both with a full heart. Later they would tend the garden, mend a fence, fold washed linens. Evening would come gently, and the fire would be fed once more. But for now they sat together, full-bellied and warm, wrapped in the quiet peace of home. And it too was enough. The sun had passed its peak, casting long, dappled shadows across the garden's edge. The cottage, now warmed from both hearth and daylight, exhaled its morning labors into the soft stillness of afternoon. Edwin pushed open the garden gate with a creak that sounded like an old tune. A pair of doves fluttered from the low stone wall, startled only for a breath. The air smelled of earth and rosemary. The soil, dark and forgiving, was still moist from last night's rain. Elfrida stood among the cabbages, apron gathered like a basket in one arm. She was collecting thyme, chives, and the last few spring onions. Her hair had slipped from its braid, a few loose strands brushing her cheek in the breeze. She didn't seem to notice. Her hands moved with quiet care, each herb snipped with the respect of someone who had grown it from seed. Edwin leaned on the fence post for a moment, just watching her. Not out of need or even affection, though both were there, but from that deeper feeling that rose when one beheld something simply right. Emma sat under the old plum tree, a worn wooden spoon in her lap, cooking in a clay bowl filled with petals and pebbles. She hummed to herself, legs kicking gently against the grass. With a soft grunt, Edwin stepped down into the rows. His task was simple today: pull weeds, loosen soil, check the squash. He moved steadily, hands deep in the dirt, the warmth of the sun soft on his back. A robin hopped nearby, watching him with twitching curiosity. "Do you remember," Elfrida asked without looking up, "when we first planted this garden?" Edwin chuckled. The rows were crooked, and we tried to grow turnips in too much shade. You were convinced the soil would learn." "It did," he said, brushing dirt from his hands. "It just needed time." So had they. In those early years the garden had been more hope than harvest. But with each season, it had grown sturdier, more familiar. Like the creak of the gate. Like the feel of their home. Like love, deepening in soil and memory. A bee buzzed lazily past, pausing on a flowering beanstalk before drifting toward the hedgerow. By late afternoon, baskets brimmed with greens, roots, and a handful of soft summer apples that had ripened ahead of their kin. Edwin wiped his brow and joined Emma beneath the plum tree. She handed him a pebble and a leaf. "For dessert," she said solemnly. He took it with a mock bow. "My compliments to the chef." Elfrida joined them soon, settling beside Edwin with a quiet sigh. For a long while none of them spoke. They simply sat in the garden's hush, surrounded by the rustling of leaves and the occasional coo of a nesting dove. The world beyond the hedgerows may have been noisy, lords and markets, carts and coin, but here in this patch of earth they had made their own. There was only the slow turning of time, the gentle breath of a wind that remembered every seed planted, every storm weathered. As the shadows stretched, Emma curled beside her mother's side, eyelids heavy, her small hand still clutching her wooden spoon. Edwin reached for Elfrida's hand, their fingers twining together like roots in the same soil. The garden didn't speak, but it had listened to their years. And now, in its stillness, it gave something back. The morning mist had lifted gently from the river, revealing its soft curves and steady rhythm. The banks were lined with reeds that whispered in the breeze, and dragonflies skimmed the surface like fleeting thoughts. Edwin stood in the shallows, his feet bare against smooth stones, the hem of his tunic damp and clinging. His small net, worn but dependable, was looped over one shoulder, and in his other hand he held a wicker creel lined with damp moss. It wasn't a day for large catches. It was a day for listening. The river was slower here, winding past meadows and woods, away from the busy crossings and toward the quiet bends where herons hunted and otters played unseen. Edwin cast his net in silence, then waited, not with urgency but with presence. He watched the ripples. He watched the light move across the surface like silk. Now and then a trout flicked its tail below, or a water vole scurried through the grass. He saw it all but did not interrupt it. This was their world as much as his. The river had been with him his whole life. As a boy, he'd played by its edge, launching bark boats and shouting into the reeds. As a young man, he'd fished it in hunger and in hope. As a husband and father, he fished it with a quiet understanding that some days it gave, and others it withheld. But always it was there. Behind him, the trees rustled with the songs of linnets. Bees bobbed lazily over the bankside wildflowers, foxglove, yarrow, tansy. Time slowed not because it needed to but because there was no reason to rush. Edwin sat for a while on a mossy stone, his catch light but enough. A few fish, no more. He packed them carefully, then poured a little water into the creel to keep the moss cool. From his pocket he pulled a bit of oatcake wrapped in cloth. It was dry but it filled the belly. As he chewed slowly he watched the clouds drift like low sailing ships. A goose honked far off. Somewhere upstream, he could hear the faint trickle of a small fall, singing its song to no one in particular. He didn't think of work or coin or need. He thought of Emma's curls, damp from her morning bath. He thought of Elfrida humming while she kneaded dough. He thought of the firewood stacked beside the hearth, of the little wooden spoon Emma had whittled with his help, and the patched blanket on the bed that still held the scent of lavender. These were not grand thoughts. They were soft ones, worn and well-loved, like a woolen cloak that had weathered many seasons. And when he rose at last, net rolled, creel balanced, and began the walk back home along the wooded path, he did not speak aloud nor quicken his step. The path wound gently as rivers do, and he followed it without question. He knew the way, and the way knew him. The cottage stood quietly at the edge of the treeline, its thatched roof dappled with lichen, its windows reflecting the pale afternoon sun. Smoke rose in a thin, steady line from the chimney, curling into the wide blue sky. The scent of bread mingled with wood smoke, drawing Edwin homeward with a pull that was more instinct than thought. As he stepped through the gate, the wooden latch softly clunked behind him. The hens clucked near the fence, pecking at the earth with rhythmic patience, and the goat, old Willa, watched him with her usual indifferent curiosity before turning back to her cud. Inside, the warmth embraced him like an old friend. The hearth crackled with steady orange glow. A blackened kettle hung above it, its lid gently rattling with the breath of boiling water. Elfrida stood at the table, her sleeves rolled, flour dusted on her arms, kneading dough with a quiet rhythm. She looked up and smiled, not wide, not showy, just enough to say, "You're home." Edwin set the creel on the bench by the wall and leaned in to kiss the top of her head. Her hair smelled of rosemary and ash. She pressed the dough one last time, then wiped her hands and peeked inside the creel. "Enough for supper," she said gently. He nodded. "The river's thoughtful today." She chuckled softly, then turned to stoke the hearth, tucking a few more slender branches beneath the pot. A rich aroma of barley and greens drifted upward, stew slow and earthy. Emma was in the corner, seated cross-legged on a woven mat, humming to herself as she stitched a scrap of cloth into what appeared to be a doll's new apron. Her tongue peeked slightly from her lips in concentration. She glanced up when she saw her father and beamed. "I made her new clothes," she declared. Edwin knelt beside her and admired the stitching, uneven but bright with effort. "She'll be the best-dressed doll in the village," he said, ruffling her hair. They sat together a while as Elfrida shaped the dough into rounds and set them to rest beneath a linen cloth. The light shifted through the window, dappling the wooden walls and the dried herbs hanging from the ceiling, thyme, bay, chamomile. A wind moved softly outside, rustling the eaves. When the bread was finally set in the oven, they gathered close to the hearth. The stew was ladled into clay bowls, and the little table was drawn near to the fire. Emma's doll sat beside her bowl, watching the meal like a quiet guest. They ate slowly with spoons worn smooth by years of use. The stew was thick and warm, the bread soft in the middle with a crisp, fire-kissed crust. No one rushed. No one needed to. Afterward, Edwin fetched a small lute from the wall. He strummed gently, just a few notes, simple and round as river stones. Emma leaned against her mother's shoulder, eyes half closed, while Elfrida hummed along, the melody drifting lazily in the warm air. Outside, dusk had begun to settle, and the first stars blinked awake in the velvet sky. There was no talk of tomorrow, no tally of worries, no plans. Just the hush of full bellies, the pop of emberwood, and the soft rise and fall of song. And in that quiet, wrapped in flickering light and the scent of baking, the little family sat, not saying much at all. They didn't need to. Night had fully embraced the valley, and the world outside the cottage lay hushed under a quilt of silver and ink. The stars shimmered, bold and quiet, threading their light across the sky like spilled grain upon black cloth. A crescent moon hung low, barely risen above the dark hills, casting a faint, cool glow over the land. Inside, the fire had burned low, now only a gentle cradle of coals. Its light flickered softly on the walls, sending slow-moving shadows that danced with a kind of sleepy grace. Edwin stood at the doorway, his silhouette outlined against the night. The door creaked slightly in the evening breeze, and the scent of dew and wood smoke met him there. He stepped out, his feet quiet on the worn stone path, and looked upward. The stars. Always the stars. He had watched them as a boy, lying on his back in damp fields, listening to the world breathe around him. He watched them now as a man with a heart full of gratitude and worn edges. Their slow, ancient shimmer reminded him that some things, many things, moved beyond his nets, beyond the catch, beyond even the seasons. Behind him, Emma slept curled in her cot, her small hand still clutching her doll. Elfrida had drifted off in the chair near the hearth, a wool blanket pulled loosely around her shoulders, her face peaceful in the glow of ash and ember. Edwin stepped further into the yard. The air was cool but not biting, a midsummer stillness that made each sound, each cricket's chirp, each rustle of wind, feel clear and distinct. He made his way to the fence, leaned his arms atop the rough wood, and gazed out over the dark fields. Somewhere beyond the trees, the river whispered. He could almost hear it, the memory of water over stone, of reeds brushing gently in the current. Even now, it continued its journey, winding through the sleeping countryside with the same steady purpose that had shaped his life. He didn't often think of time as something to chase. The days came as they came. But tonight, with the stars stretching above and the earth so still beneath him, he felt the years, how they had passed slowly, kindly, with their hardships and blessings, like the river's own rhythm. He thought of his father and of the old man's hands, rough, strong and sure, as they had taught him the net and the oar, the knots and currents. He wondered what Emma would carry forward. Not just skills but silences like this one. The ability to pause. To be still. To find peace not in great events but in evenings like this. A soft noise stirred behind him. Elfrida had come to the doorway, wrapping her shawl tighter as she stepped into the moonlight. "You always talk to the stars?" she asked gently, voice hushed. Edwin smiled, looking over at her. "Only when they listen." She walked to his side and leaned beside him on the fence, her shoulder touching his. "They always listen," she said. And so they stood side by side under the wide sky, saying little, breathing deeply. The wind touched the tops of the trees, and somewhere an owl called out, a low, round sound echoing across the field. The world felt whole. Not perfect, but whole. And in that moment, under the stars and the hush of the valley, it was enough. Dawn came quietly. Not with fanfare nor with color, but with a slow, silvery softening of the world. The mist that rose from the river drifted in over the fields, wrapping trees and hedgerows in a gossamer veil. It was the kind of morning that blurred the line between sleep and waking, a gentle hand brushing the cheek of the earth. Edwin was already awake. Not hurried, not restless, simply drawn by habit and the rhythm of his days. He stood by the hearth, stirring the embers with care, coaxing them to life. The faint glow deepened, spread, then licked up into flame. A kettle soon sat above the fire, and the smell of peat and warm iron filled the room. Elfrida joined him wordlessly, a quiet nod between them. She pulled her shawl tighter, then began preparing the morning meal. Oats were set to boil, and bits of dried apple were added. Nothing extravagant, but enough to warm the belly. Emma awoke with a soft yawn, blinking into the pale morning light that filtered through the small window. Her hair was tousled, her doll still clutched in her arms. "Papa?" she murmured. "I'm here," Edwin answered gently. She rose, stretching, then padded across the floor to sit by the hearth, eyes fixed on the glowing coals. Edwin ruffled her hair with a smile and handed her a warm bowl a few moments later. Outside, the world brightened slowly, shadows softening across the garden path and the worn roof slates. Birds began to sing, first a single thrush, then a chorus, tentative and sleepy but certain. Life returning with the light. After the meal, Edwin stepped outside, his net slung over his shoulder. The sky had turned from gray to pearl, and the mist was beginning to lift. The walk to the river felt familiar, like retracing a line in a beloved poem. Boots against damp grass, the scent of earth and water in the air. When he reached the riverbank he paused. The river shimmered like brushed silver, the surface smooth save for a few ripples. Dragonflies skimmed low and reeds rustled gently in the breeze. He set to work, not quickly but steadily. The net was cast, the rhythm returning to his arms and hands. His movements were slow and practiced, each gesture part of a quiet dance learned over decades. There was peace in the work. Not excitement, not urgency, but a grounded, dependable sort of peace. Each small catch, roach, perch, the occasional fat tench, was greeted with a murmured thanks. He kept what was needed. Nothing more. By midday he returned with a modest basket, the fish glistening, their scales catching bits of sunlight. Elfrida was in the garden, tending to herbs and pulling the last of the onions. Emma was nearby, drawing in the dirt with a stick, her voice humming a small tune to herself. Edwin entered the cottage and began to clean the fish. The scent of lavender and smoke mingled with the fresh, clean smell of river and scale. They would eat together soon. There would be no guests, no celebrations. Just food, warmth, and company. And after the meal, perhaps a story by the hearth. Perhaps a walk through the long grass. Perhaps silence. Whatever came, it would be enough. Because life, Edwin knew, was not measured in great days but in ordinary ones. In river mornings and quiet returns. In soft oats and shared glances. In knowing, deep in the marrow, that one belonged to the land, to the rhythm, to the stillness. And so the day passed, unmarked by history, untouched by drama. But full. And that fullness, as Edwin sat beneath the evening sky once again, was all he ever needed. Night returned as it always did, not with alarm or drama, but with a soft descent, like a great velvet cloak being pulled gently over the shoulders of the earth. Edwin sat just outside the cottage on the worn stone step beneath the old wooden lintel. His hands rested on his knees and his face turned skyward. Overhead, stars had begun to pierce the deep blue, tiny glints of light flickering through the heavens like candle flames in a cathedral. Behind him the cottage was quiet. Elfrida had gone to bed, her hands tired from mending and stirring and kneading. Emma was curled beneath a wool blanket, her doll tucked beside her, her soft breaths barely stirring the silence of the room. The night air was cool but not biting. Summer still clung gently to the land, reluctant to release its hold entirely. A breeze passed through the garden, rustling the tall grasses and bending the last blooms of the chamomile. Somewhere near the hedgerow, a nightjar called its soft, eerie cry, then fell silent again. Edwin watched the stars emerge one by one. Watched a pale wisp of cloud drift low across the horizon. Watched the wind trace a path through the trees. He was not waiting for anything. He did not expect a revelation nor a change. Only the comfort of being small beneath something vast. Of belonging to a world that turned quietly, steadily, without needing to be understood. His thoughts wandered slowly. He thought of his father, long gone, and the times they had sat by this very riverbank with their feet in the water, nets resting at their sides. He thought of winters when the hearth had barely stayed alight and summers when the harvest had been so bountiful the baskets nearly burst. He thought of Emma's first steps, and how she had laughed when she fell into the garden mud, covered head to toe, delighted by the mess of it all. And he thought, too, of how life had unfolded, not in grand events but in small rituals. The casting of a net. The mending of a roof. The turning of the seasons. Above him, a shooting star whispered across the sky, just a brief stroke of light, vanishing almost before it was noticed. But Edwin saw it, and he smiled. Because in that moment, with his boots on the stone step and the scent of wood smoke lingering in his clothes, everything was enough. No riches. No fame. No need for more. Just a cottage filled with warmth. A daughter sleeping soundly. A wife whose hands he knew better than his own. A river that would still be flowing tomorrow. He stood at last, joints creaking slightly, and stepped inside. The door closed with a soft thud. The fire had faded, glowing only faintly in the hearth, casting long shadows on the beams above. Edwin knelt to cover the coals with ash, preserving their warmth for morning. Then he climbed into bed beside Elfrida. She shifted just slightly, murmuring in her sleep, then settled again. Outside the stars watched, and inside all was still. The river flowed. The world breathed, and sleep came quietly. As the night deepens and the fire turns to embers, we leave Edwin's world behind. The cottage fades into the hush of the countryside. The river carries on its quiet journey, winding past the willows, past the stones, past the memory of a man who lived simply and fully by its banks. There were no great battles here. No thrones to seize. Only hands that mended nets. A hearth that warmed tired feet. A family that found joy in each other, in the turning of the earth, in the rise and fall of the river's song. And perhaps that is the quiet truth hidden in the folds of history, not in the noise of kings, but in the hush of everyday life. So now, let your thoughts settle like silt beneath still waters. Let the flicker of candlelight guide you toward rest. And may your dreams drift gently, like a boat upon a calm and timeless stream.